Picture this. I'm Emma Rodriguez, 26 years old, sitting in a mahogany-paneled conference room in downtown Denver, surrounded by relatives who only show up when there's money involved. The family attorney, Mr. Davidson, adjusts his wire-rimmed glasses and reads from my late grandmother's will in his methodical voice. To my granddaughter, Emma Rodriguez, I bequeath the wooden mantel clock from my study. The reaction is immediate and brutal. My cousin Tyler actually snorts with laughter, while my Aunt Monica rolls her eyes so hard I'm surprised they don't fall out of her head. Seriously? Tyler whispers loud enough for everyone to hear. Grandma Rose left her the broken clock that hasn't worked in 20 years? My cousin Stephanie joins in, shaking her head with mock sympathy. Poor Emma gets the garage sale reject while we get the real valuables. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that this worthless timepiece they were all mocking would soon be appraised at over $3 million, exposing decades of family lies and transforming my entire world in ways I never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My story begins in the suburbs of Aurora, Colorado, where I grew up as the family disappointment. While my cousins Tyler and Stephanie Chen lived in sprawling houses in Cherry Hills Village with their parents who worked in finance and real estate, I was raised by my single mother, Carmen Rodriguez, in a modest two-bedroom ranch house that had seen better days. My father had left when I was 7, and ever since then, the wealthy side of my family, my mother's relatives, treated us like charity cases they were obligated to acknowledge at Christmas and Easter. The matriarch of our family was my grandmother Rose Chen, a formidable woman who had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1960s and built a successful import business specializing in Asian antiques and collectibles. Her company, Golden Dragon Imports, had made her wealthy enough to afford a stunning craftsman-style home in the historic Highlands neighborhood of Denver, complete with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and rooms filled with what everyone assumed were valuable artifacts from her decades in the antique trade. Grandma Rose was 73 when she passed last month, and up until her final days, she maintained the sharp mind and keen eye that had made her business so successful. She could spot a reproduction from 50 feet away and had an encyclopedic knowledge of Asian art, furniture, and decorative objects that had earned her respect throughout the Denver antique community. Growing up, I was the only grandchild who showed any genuine interest in spending time with her. While Tyler and Stephanie would reluctantly attend family gatherings, spending most of their time on their phones or complaining about being bored, I found myself fascinated by Grandma Rose's stories about her adventures in the antique world. She would tell me about traveling to estate sales across the country, about learning to negotiate with dealers who tried to take advantage of her because she was a woman and an immigrant, and about developing the instincts necessary to recognize authentic pieces among rooms full of reproductions and forgeries. Every Saturday throughout my childhood and teenage years, I would take the bus from Aurora to Grandma Rose's house in the Highlands, where she would teach me about different periods of furniture, how to identify various types of wood and metalwork, and most importantly, how to research the provenance of potentially valuable pieces. Her study was my favorite room in the house, lined floor to ceiling with reference books, catalogs from auction houses, and journals, where she meticulously documented every piece that passed through her business. The centerpiece of that study was an ornate wooden mantel clock that sat on the shelf behind her desk. It was about 18 inches tall, made of what appeared to be dark walnut, with intricate carved details and brass fittings that had developed a rich patina over the years. The clock face was porcelain white with Roman numerals, and the hands had stopped working sometime before I was born. Whenever I asked Grandma Rose about it, she would get a mysterious smile and say, "That old thing has been with me longer than anyone realizes, Emma. Someday you'll understand its real story." My family, particularly my Aunt Monica and Uncle Richard, Tyler and Stephanie's parents, never understood my fascination with what they dismissively called old junk. They viewed Grandma Rose's antique collection as curiosities at best, valuable inventory at worst, but certainly not something that any modern person should find genuinely interesting. During family gatherings, I would often overhear them making comments about how Grandma Rose should modernize her decor or cash in on some of her dusty collectibles while the market was good. The truth was, They had never bothered to really look at anything in Grandma Rose's house. They saw it all as outdated furniture and foreign knickknacks, failing to recognize that she had spent 40 years carefully curating a collection of museum-quality pieces. Their lack of appreciation was something that Grandma Rose noticed but rarely commented on directly. Instead, she would share her knowledge with me, the one grandchild who seemed to value history and craftsmanship over immediate monetary gain. After graduating from the University of Colorado with a degree in art history and museum studies, I shocked my family by accepting a position as an assistant curator at the Denver Art Museum, specializing in Asian art and decorative objects. The job paid $38,000 a year, barely enough to cover my student loans and rent on a small apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. But it allowed me to work with the kinds of historical artifacts that had fascinated me since childhood. My career choice was met with a mixture of bewilderment and condescension from my extended family. At family gatherings, Aunt Monica would pat my hand sympathetically and say things like, "It's wonderful that you're following your passion, dear, but when are you going to think about getting a real job that can support a family?" Uncle Richard was more direct, suggesting that I was wasting my education and should consider transitioning into something more practical, like real estate or marketing. Tyler, who worked in software development and made 6 figures straight out of college, loved to needle me about my career choice. "Come on, Emma," he would say with his characteristic smirk. "How long can you survive on museum wages? When are you going to get serious about making real money?" Stephanie, who had parlayed her communications degree into a successful social media marketing business, was slightly more tactful but equally dismissive. She would post photos of her expensive purchases on Instagram while making comments about how some people prioritized experiences over material success, which everyone understood was a dig at my modest lifestyle. But Grandma Rose understood and supported my passion in ways that no one else in the family did. She would visit me at the museum, spending hours examining our permanent collection and offering insights that sometimes surprised even the senior curators. She had an intuitive understanding of how to read the subtle details that distinguished authentic pieces from skillful reproductions, and she could often provide historical context that enhanced our understanding of particular artifacts. During our Saturday visits, she began teaching me more advanced techniques for authenticating antiques. She showed me how to examine tool marks on hand-carved furniture, how to identify the telltale signs of aging in different types of wood and metal, and how to research the backgrounds of specific artisans and workshops. These skills proved invaluable in my museum work, and I began to develop a reputation among my colleagues for my ability to spot pieces that warranted further investigation. More importantly, Grandma Rose taught me to value objects for their historical significance and cultural importance, rather than just their monetary worth. "Money comes and goes, Emma," she would tell me while we examined a piece of Celadon pottery or studied the joinery techniques on an antique cabinet. "But history, craftsmanship, beauty, these things last forever if we care for them properly." This philosophy put me at odds with the rest of my family, who seemed to view everything through the lens of immediate financial benefit. When Tyler bought his first house, a modern McMansion in a development where every house looked identical, he couldn't understand why I chose to rent a small apartment in a 1920s building with original hardwood floors and period fixtures. When Stephanie leased a brand new luxury SUV, she criticized my decision to keep driving the reliable but unremarkable Honda Civic that had gotten me through college. The disconnect between my values and those of my extended family became even more apparent as Grandma Rose's health began to decline. About 2 years ago, she started showing signs of the heart condition that would eventually claim her life. Rather than slowing down, she seemed to become more focused on organizing her affairs and ensuring that her collection would be properly cared for after her death. I began spending even more time at her house, helping her catalog and photograph pieces that she wanted to document for insurance purposes. During these sessions, she would share stories about how she had acquired particular items, and I began to understand that her collection was far more valuable and historically significant than even I had realized. She had pieces that dated back centuries, artifacts that had been owned by important historical figures, and decorative objects that represented the finest examples of their particular styles and periods. What struck me most during this time was how little interest Tyler and Stephanie showed in Grandma Rose's stories or her collection. When they visited, which became more frequent as her health declined, they seemed primarily concerned with practical matters like her medical care and legal arrangements. They would bring their laptops and spend their time researching things like estate planning and inheritance tax implications, rather than listening to the fascinating histories of the objects that surrounded them. Tyler, in particular, seemed to view Grandma Rose's house as a future financial asset, rather than a home filled with meaningful possessions. I would catch him taking photos of rooms and furniture, and when I asked him about it, he claimed he was just documenting things for insurance purposes. But something about his secretive behavior made me uncomfortable, and I began to suspect that he was already calculating the potential value of various items. Stephanie was more subtle but equally focused on the financial aspects of Grandma Rose's situation. She would ask detailed questions about the import business, about insurance policies, and about Grandma Rose's relationships with dealers and auction houses. When I mentioned these conversations to Grandma Rose, she would just smile and say, "Let them think what they want to think, Emma. I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between people who love beautiful things and people who just see dollar signs." During what turned out to be our last extended conversation, Grandma Rose pulled me aside and spoke more directly about the family dynamics than she ever had before. We were sitting in her study, surrounded by the books and artifacts that had been the foundation of her life's work, and she seemed to be choosing her words very carefully. "Emma," she said, her voice still strong despite her physical frailness, "I want you to know that I've been thinking very carefully about what will happen to my collection after I'm gone. Your cousins see these things as commodities to be sold, but you understand that they're pieces of history that deserve to be preserved and appreciated." I tried to protest that she shouldn't be thinking about such things, but she waved away my objections with a gentle smile. "I'm 73 years old, and I've had a wonderful life doing work that I loved. I'm not afraid of what comes next, but I am concerned about making sure that the right people end up caring for the things I've spent my lifetime collecting." She gestured toward the mantel clock that had always intrigued me, the one with the stopped hands and the mysterious history that she had never fully explained. That clock, for instance, has a story that goes back much further than anyone in this family realizes. Someday, when the time is right, you'll learn what it really represents. I asked her what she meant, but she just smiled and said, "Some things are better discovered than explained, Emma. Trust me when I tell you that appearances can be very deceiving, especially when it comes to objects that have survived for generations." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Looking back now, I realized that Grandma Rose was trying to prepare me for what was coming without giving away the surprises she had planned. She knew exactly what she was doing when she wrote her will, and she understood how each member of the family would react to their respective bequests. She had spent decades observing our priorities and values, and she had made her decisions accordingly. The last time I saw Grandma Rose alive, she was sitting in her favorite chair in the study, surrounded by the collection that had been her life's passion. She looked peaceful and content, and when I kissed her goodbye, she squeezed my hand and said, "Remember, Emma, the most valuable things in life are often the ones that other people overlook. Don't ever let anyone convince you that worth can only be measured in dollars." She passed away quietly in her sleep 3 days later, leaving behind a family that was about to discover just how little they had understood about the woman who had been the foundation of their prosperity, and the true value of the treasures she had spent her lifetime collecting. The funeral arrangements became a battleground that revealed everything I needed to know about my family's priorities. Within hours of Grandma Rose's peaceful passing, Tyler and Stephanie had taken over the planning process with the efficiency of corporate executives managing a hostile takeover. They insisted on holding the service at the most expensive funeral home in Cherry Creek, complete with elaborate floral arrangements that cost more than I made in a month, and a reception at the Denver Country Club that Grandma Rose would have found pretentious and wasteful. I sat in the corner during the reception, watching relatives I hadn't seen in years suddenly appear with stories about how much Grandma Rose had meant to them. Cousin after cousin approached the microphone to share memories that sounded suspiciously similar and completely fabricated. They spoke about her generous spirit and family devotion, while carefully avoiding any mention of the antique business that had actually defined her life's work. What struck me most was how few people seemed to understand who Grandma Rose really was. They talked about her as if she had been a conventional grandmother who baked cookies and knitted sweaters, rather than the sharp-minded businesswoman who had built an empire by outmaneuvering dealers twice her size in a male-dominated industry. The stories they told could have been about any elderly relative, generic and safe, scrubbed clean of the fierce intelligence and cultural pride that had actually characterized her personality. Tyler stood at the podium looking appropriately solemn in his expensive charcoal suit, delivering a eulogy that focused primarily on Grandma Rose's role as a family provider, rather than her achievements as an entrepreneur and collector. He spoke about her sacrifice and hard work in terms that made it sound like she had spent her life in some kind of noble suffering, rather than pursuing a passion that had brought her both financial success and deep personal satisfaction. Stephanie followed with remarks that emphasized Grandma Rose's traditional values and, quote, dedication to family, conveniently ignoring the fact that she had been one of the first Asian women to establish a successful import business in Denver and had broken barriers that her granddaughter was apparently unwilling to acknowledge publicly. The entire presentation felt like an attempt to diminish Grandma Rose's complexity and reduce her to a more comfortable, conventional narrative. During the reception, I overheard conversations that made my stomach turn. Small groups of relatives clustered around the hors d'oeuvre tableau, speaking in hushed tones about estate values and inheritance possibilities. Uncle Richard held court near the bar, explaining to anyone who would listen that the family needed to be practical about liquidating Grandma Rose's assets and dividing the proceeds fairly among the survivors. Aunt Monica moved through the crowd like a political candidate working a fundraiser, touching arms and speaking earnestly about the need to, quote, honor Rose's memory by making responsible decisions about her estate. When she cornered me near the coat check, her sympathy felt as authentic as a telemarketer's smile. "Emma, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured concern, "I hope you understand that we're all going to need to work together during this difficult time. Your grandmother accumulated so many things over the years, and it's going to take careful planning to handle everything appropriately." I asked her what she meant by appropriately, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Well, darling, we need to be realistic about what has actual value and what's just sentimental clutter. Your grandmother was wonderful, but let's face it, she was a bit of a pack rat. The house is absolutely stuffed with furniture and decorations that haven't been updated in decades. We'll need to sort through everything systematically and make sure the family gets the maximum benefit from the estate." The way she said maximum benefit made it clear that she was already calculating auction values and dividing potential profits. I wanted to tell her that Grandma Rose's clutter included museum-quality pieces that she was probably too ignorant to recognize. But I held my tongue. Something about the predatory gleam in her eyes warned me that showing my hand too early would be a mistake. The conversation that really opened my eyes happened near the end of the reception, when I accidentally overheard Tyler and Stephanie talking privately in an alcove near the country club's main dining room. They thought they were speaking quietly, but their voices carried just enough for me to catch the gist of their discussion. "Did you get a chance to walk through the house again?" Stephanie asked, checking her phone as she spoke. "Yeah, last week when we were supposed to be helping with her medications," Tyler replied with a callousness that shocked me. "I took pictures of everything in the main rooms. Most of it's probably not worth much, but there are a few pieces that might bring decent money at auction." "What about all those Asian art pieces?" She always claimed they were valuable. Tyler shrugged dismissively. "Hard to tell. A lot of that stuff looks impressive, but turns out to be mass-produced tourist crap when you actually have it appraised. We'll need to bring in experts to separate the wheat from the chaff." Either way, the house itself is worth at least $700,000, probably more if we update the kitchen and bathrooms before we list it. And there's got to be $50,000 worth of furniture and accessories, even if most of it's outdated. I felt sick listening to them reduce Grandma Rose's carefully curated collection to rough dollar estimates. But what came next was even worse. "What about Emma?" The gesture was unprecedented in our family history, representing a level of attention and respect that had always been reserved for David's achievements and milestones. The sight of them waiting for me felt like stepping into an alternate reality, where my success mattered as much as my brother's legal career. My mother emerged from the passenger side of the car, wearing what I recognized as her best dress, the navy blue outfit she typically reserved for special occasions and important social events. Her careful attention to appearance suggested she understood that this reunion was significant, that the daughter returning from her corporate helicopter was someone deserving of the kind of respect she had always shown David's professional accomplishments. David and Amanda followed, both looking genuinely excited to see me rather than displaying the polite tolerance that had characterized most of our family interactions over the past decade. Amanda was carrying what appeared to be a small gift bag, suggesting they had taken time to select something special to mark this transformation in our family relationships. My father approached the helicopter with an expression of wonder that reminded me of his reaction to David's law school graduation, a mixture of pride and amazement that I had rarely seen directed toward my achievements. Robert Mitchell had always been a modest man whose greatest professional excitement came from helping small business clients navigate tax season. But his face reflected genuine awe at witnessing his daughter arrive via corporate aircraft after managing a Fortune 500 emergency. "Sarah, sweetheart," he said, embracing me with uncharacteristic intensity, "we've spent the entire weekend learning about your company and reading about supply chain management, and we can't believe how accomplished you are. Your mother has been showing your business articles to every neighbor who will listen, and I think Mrs. Henderson is considering framing that photograph she took of your helicopter landing." His words were both touching and slightly amusing. The image of my status-conscious mother proudly sharing articles about my professional achievements, representing a complete reversal of her previous approach to discussing my career. Linda Mitchell had spent years deflecting questions about my work with vague references to minor coordinator positions. But apparently my helicopter extraction had transformed me into a source of neighborhood bragging rights. My mother approached with tears in her eyes, her typically composed demeanor softened by what appeared to be genuine emotion. "Sarah, I owe you the biggest apology of my life," she said, her voice unsteady with feeling. "I spent so many years dismissing your career because I didn't understand it, because it didn't fit my narrow definition of success. I was wrong, terribly wrong, and I'm so sorry for all the times I made you feel like your achievements didn't matter." Her apology was everything I had wanted to hear for years, but receiving it felt more complicated than I had anticipated. The validation was deeply satisfying, but it also highlighted how much time and emotional energy had been wasted maintaining barriers between my professional success and personal relationships. The recognition I was receiving felt both wonderful and overdue, colored by years of accumulated hurt that couldn't be instantly erased by a single acknowledgement. His introduction was brief and professional, expressing appropriate condolences before transitioning directly to the business at hand. "Before we begin with the formal reading," Davidson said, settling his wire-rimmed glasses on his nose, "I want to note that Mrs. Chen was very specific about her wishes regarding the distribution of her estate. She spent considerable time ensuring that her instructions were clear and legally binding, and she explicitly stated that she did not want her decisions to be subject to negotiation or revision." Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I caught him exchanging a meaningful glance with Uncle Richard. Clearly, they had been hoping for some flexibility in whatever arrangements Grandma Rose had made. Davidson began with the standard legal language, reading through the preliminary sections of the will with the methodical precision of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times. Then he moved on to the specific bequests, starting with small gifts to neighbors, longtime employees, and charitable organizations that had been important to Grandma Rose during her lifetime. Mrs. Sullivan, who had cleaned Grandma Rose's house for 20 years, received $5,000 and a jade bracelet that she had always admired. The Denver Art Museum, where I worked, received a cash donation of $15,000, specifically designated for their Asian Art Acquisition Fund. Several other local cultural organizations received similar gifts, reflecting Grandma Rose's commitment to preserving and sharing the artistic heritage that had been central to her professional life. Then Davidson reached the section that everyone had been waiting for, the distribution of major assets among family members. "To my nephew Tyler Chen," Davidson read in his measured tone, "I leave my dining room furniture set, including the table, chairs, sideboard, and china cabinet, along with the porcelain collection displayed therein, valued at approximately $18,000. Tyler smiled with satisfaction, clearly pleased with what he perceived as a generous and appropriate inheritance. The dining room set was beautiful, a matching collection of dark wood furniture that Grandma Rose had acquired early in her business career, and the porcelain pieces were genuinely valuable examples of Chinese export ceramics from the 18th and 19th centuries. To my niece Stephanie Wong, Davidson continued, I leave my bedroom furniture set, including the bed frame, dresser, nightstands, and armoire, along with my personal jewelry collection, valued at approximately $15,000. Stephanie looked equally pleased, though I could see her mentally calculating whether her inheritance was proportionally fair compared to Tyler's. The bedroom set was equally impressive, featuring intricate mother-of-pearl inlay work that demonstrated exceptional craftsmanship, and Grandma Rose's jewelry collection included several pieces with significant historical and cultural value. To my daughter-in-law, Carmen Rodriguez, Davidson read, glancing toward my mother, I leave my collection of family photographs, personal papers, and memorabilia, along with a cash bequest of $10,000 to assist with any immediate financial needs. My mother looked surprised and touched by the cash gift, which represented more money than she typically saw at one time. The photographs and papers might not have seemed valuable to the others, but I knew they contained irreplaceable documentation of our family's immigration story and Grandma Rose's early years building her business. Then Davidson reached my name, and the entire room seemed to lean forward slightly in anticipation. To my granddaughter Emma Rodriguez, who alone among my descendants has shown genuine appreciation for history and craftsmanship, I leave the wooden mantel clock from my study. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Tyler actually snorted with laughter, a sound so inappropriate and disrespectful that even Davidson looked startled. Stephanie covered her mouth, but I could see her shoulders shaking with suppressed giggles. Aunt Monica and Uncle Richard exchanged glances that clearly communicated their relief that the real valuables had gone to their children rather than to the family's poor relation. "Are you serious?" Tyler said, abandoning any pretense of funeral propriety. "Grandma Rose left Emma that old broken clock that doesn't even work? It's been sitting on her shelf gathering dust for as long as I can remember." Stephanie joined in with mock sympathy that felt like a slap across the face. "Oh, Emma, I'm so sorry. That seems really unfair. I mean, we got furniture sets and valuable collections, and you got a broken clock?" The room filled with murmurs of agreement and what sounded like barely suppressed laughter. Even some of the more distant relatives who had received small but respectable bequests seemed to view my inheritance as evidence that Grandma Rose had either made a mistake or harbored some kind of resentment toward me. Uncle Richard cleared his throat and addressed Davidson directly. "James, with all due respect, this seems like an oversight. Rose was quite elderly in her final months, and it's possible that her judgment was compromised. Surely there's some mechanism for correcting obvious errors in the distribution?" Davidson's expression remained carefully neutral, but I detected a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he had been expecting this kind of challenge. I can assure you that Mrs. Chen was completely lucid and decisive when she drafted this will. She specifically mentioned the clock bequest and asked me to include a personal note explaining her reasoning. He produced a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Grandma Rose's distinctive handwriting. "Emma, your grandmother requested that you read this privately, but if you choose to share its contents with the family, that's entirely your decision." I took the envelope with trembling hands, acutely aware that every person in the room was watching my reaction. Part of me wanted to tear it open immediately and discover what Grandma Rose had been thinking. But another part of me dreaded learning that she really had made some kind of mistake or cruel joke at my expense. "There must be some explanation," Aunt Monica said, her voice filled with the kind of false concern that barely masked her satisfaction with her own children's inheritances. "Perhaps Rose intended for Emma to receive something else but got confused about the details." Tyler nodded eagerly. "Exactly. I mean, no offense to Emma, but it doesn't make sense for her to get a broken antique while the rest of us received functional furniture and valuable collections. Maybe Grandma Rose meant to leave her the jewelry box from the bedroom, or some of the smaller art pieces that would be more appropriate for her apartment." The condescending way he suggested more appropriate alternatives made it clear that he viewed me as someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps the family decided to throw in my direction. In his mind, I was too poor and too insignificant to deserve anything of real value, so surely there had been some kind of administrative error that needed to be corrected. Davidson maintained his professional composure, but I could sense his growing irritation with the family's assumption that they could simply override Grandma Rose's clearly stated wishes. I understand your concerns, but I must emphasize that Mrs. Chen was very specific about her intentions. She spent several hours discussing the clock bequest with me, and she was adamant that Emma should receive exactly what she specified. But why? Stephanie asked, her voice rising with frustration. What's so special about a broken clock that doesn't even work? It's not like Emma has some kind of sentimental attachment to it. None of us even knew it existed until today. That wasn't entirely true. I had noticed the clock many times during my visits to Grandma Rose's study, and I had always been curious about its history and significance. But I had never expressed any particular interest in owning it, so I understood why the family was confused by Grandma Rose's decision to single it out as my specific inheritance. Davidson consulted his notes before responding. Mrs. Chen told me that Emma would understand the significance of the clock once she had an opportunity to examine it properly. She also mentioned that appearances can be deceiving, especially when it comes to objects that have been in families for generations. The cryptic nature of this explanation only seemed to increase the family's skepticism. Tyler threw up his hands in exasperation. So we're supposed to believe that some old clock that's been broken for decades is actually valuable? Come on, James, that sounds like the kind of thing elderly people say when they're not thinking clearly. I'm simply conveying Mrs. Chen's exact words, Davidson replied with the patience of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult clients. She was quite insistent that Emma should receive the clock, and she seemed confident that its true value would become apparent in due time. Uncle Richard leaned forward in his chair, adopting the aggressive posture he used when negotiating business deals. James, I think we need to consider the possibility that Rose was not competent to make these kinds of decisions in her final months. Cancer medications can cause confusion and impaired judgment, and it's possible that she made choices that don't reflect her actual intentions. The suggestion that Grandma Rose had been mentally incompetent made me angry enough to find my voice for the first time since the reading began. Grandma Rose was sharp as a tack right up until the end, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she had good reasons for every decision she made. Tyler turned toward me with the kind of patronizing smile that made me want to throw something. Emma, I know you want to believe that, but you have to admit this doesn't make any sense. Why would Grandma Rose leave you something broken and worthless, while giving the rest of us valuable furniture and collections? It's not fair to you, and it's not what she would have wanted if she had been thinking clearly. The assumption that I was too naive to recognize unfair treatment was almost as insulting as the implication that Grandma Rose had been senile. I clutched the sealed envelope tighter, wishing I could read its contents before continuing this conversation, but reluctant to share something so personal with people who were already mocking my inheritance. Maybe, Stephanie suggested with false generosity, we should consider redistributing things more equitably. Emma could take some of the smaller pieces from our collections, and we could find a more appropriate home for the clock. I mean, what's Emma gonna do with a broken antique in her tiny apartment? The offer was clearly designed to make her look magnanimous while ensuring that I received something they considered more suitable for my station in life. The casual dismissal of my intelligence and my right to receive exactly what Grandma Rose had chosen for me revealed everything I needed to know about how they viewed my place in the family hierarchy. Davidson intervened before I could respond to Stephanie's insulting proposal. I'm afraid that won't be possible. Mrs. Chen's will is very specific about the distribution of her assets, and there are no provisions for modifications or exchanges. Each bequest is final and binding. But surely there's some kind of appeals process, Aunt Monica protested. Some mechanism for addressing obvious mistakes or inequities in the distribution? The only grounds for challenging a will are evidence of fraud, undue influence, or mental incapacity at the time of drafting, Davidson explained patiently. Mrs. Chen underwent a complete mental competency evaluation just 3 months ago as part of her estate planning process, and she passed with flying colors. Her decisions were made with full awareness of their implications, and they reflect her genuine intentions regarding the disposition of her property. The mention of a recent competency evaluation effectively demolished the family's argument that Grandma Rose had been confused or impaired when she made her final decisions. Tyler's face flushed with frustration, while Uncle Richard began shuffling through papers as if searching for some legal loophole that might allow them to override her wishes. "This is ridiculous," Tyler muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "So Emma gets a worthless broken clock, and the rest of us are supposed to pretend that's fair? What kind of message does that send about family loyalty and treating people equitably?" I almost laughed at his sudden concern for fairness and family loyalty, considering that he had spent the last 10 years treating me like an embarrassing poor relation who should be grateful for any attention from her successful cousins. The idea that he was now worried about equitable treatment would have been amusing if it hadn't been so transparently self-serving. Davidson began gathering his papers, signaling that the formal reading was complete. "If there are no further questions about the specific bequests, I believe we've covered all the essential information. Emma, you'll need to coordinate with the family to arrange pickup of your inheritance, and I'll provide you with all the necessary documentation for insurance and registration purposes." The aftermath of the will reading felt like being trapped in a theater where everyone was performing their concern for my benefit while secretly celebrating their own good fortune. As we filed out of Davidson's conference room, family members who had barely acknowledged my existence for years suddenly became very interested in my emotional well-being and my plans for dealing with my disappointing inheritance. Aunt Monica cornered me near the elevators, her perfectly manicured hand resting on my arm with the kind of fake maternal concern that made my skin crawl. "Emma, sweetheart, I hope you're not too upset about this whole situation. I'm sure your grandmother had her reasons, even if they don't make sense to the rest of us." The implication that Grandma Rose's decision was inexplicable to rational people was clearly designed to make me feel embarrassed about defending her choices. Monica's tone suggested that she viewed me as a victim who needed protection from my own grandmother's arbitrary cruelty. "I'm not upset," I replied, though that wasn't entirely true. I was confused and hurt by the family's reaction, even if I wasn't disappointed by the inheritance itself. Grandma Rose knew what she was doing. Monica's smile became even more condescending. "Of course she did, dear. But you have to admit that leaving you a broken clock while giving Tyler and Stephanie valuable furniture sets seems a bit unbalanced. Perhaps she intended to leave you something else but got confused about the details in her final months." The suggestion that confusion explained Grandma Rose's decision was clearly meant to give me an excuse to accept a different arrangement without losing face. Monica was offering me a way to claim that my grandmother had made a mistake, which would justify redistributing the inheritances in a way that she considered more appropriate. "The clock isn't broken," I said, surprising myself with the confidence in my voice. "It just needs to be wound and properly maintained." Grandma Rose taught me how to care for antique timepieces during my visits. This was only partially true. I knew some basic principles about clock maintenance, but I had never actually worked on the mantel clock specifically. However, something about Monica's assumption that I had received something worthless made me want to defend both Grandma Rose's judgment and my own ability to appreciate whatever she had chosen for me. Tyler approached our conversation with the aggressive stride of someone who had decided to take charge of a situation that was spinning out of his control. "Emma, we need to talk about this whole inheritance thing. I know you're probably feeling defensive about Grandma Rose's decisions, but we all need to be realistic about what makes sense for everyone involved." His tone was the same one he used when explaining basic concepts to people he considered intellectually inferior, and his assumption that I was being defensive, rather than simply honest about my feelings, revealed exactly how he viewed my perspective. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this conversation was heading. "Look, I'm not trying to be cruel here, but let's face it. You live in a tiny apartment, and you're barely making ends meet on your museum salary. What are you going to do with an antique clock that probably needs expensive restoration work? It doesn't make practical sense for you to keep something that you can't afford to maintain properly. The casual way he dismissed both my living situation and my financial capability was breathtaking in its arrogance. Tyler had never visited my apartment, so his description of it as tiny was based purely on his assumption that anyone who made less money than he did must live in squalor. Similarly, his certainty that I couldn't afford clock restoration reflected his broader belief that poor people shouldn't be trusted with nice things. Besides, Stephanie added, joining our impromptu family conference, you don't really have the space to display a mantel clock properly. We have houses with actual mantels and appropriate settings for antique furniture. It would probably be happier in an environment where it can be showcased the way Grandma Rose would have wanted. The idea that an inanimate object would be happier in a more expensive house was so absurd that I almost laughed. But Stephanie's underlying message was clear. Nice things belonged with wealthy people, and I should be grateful to let my social superiors provide appropriate homes for valuables that were too good for someone of my economic status. I appreciate your concern, I said, trying to keep my voice level, but I'm planning to keep the clock. Grandma Rose left it to me specifically, and I want to honor her wishes. Uncle Richard, who had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience, decided to adopt a more direct approach. Emma, you're being stubborn about this, and it's not helping anyone. We're trying to find a solution that works for everybody, but you're acting like we're trying to cheat you out of something valuable. The accusation that I was being stubborn for wanting to keep my own inheritance was so outrageous that I momentarily lost the ability to respond. Richard's framing of the situation made it sound like I was being unreasonable for refusing to give away something that legally belonged to me. What kind of solution did you have in mind? I asked, curious to hear exactly how they planned to justify taking away my inheritance while making it sound like they were doing me a favor. Tyler and Stephanie exchanged glances before Tyler took the lead. We've been talking, and we think the fairest thing would be for you to take some smaller pieces from our collections. Maybe some of the jewelry from Stephanie's inheritance, or a few of the porcelain pieces from mine. Things that would be more practical for your lifestyle and more valuable than a broken clock. The offer was structured to make them sound generous while ensuring that I received items they considered less important than their main inheritances. They were essentially proposing to give me their leftovers in exchange for something they assumed was worthless, which would allow them to feel magnanimous while protecting their own interests. And what would happen to the clock? I asked. We'd find an appropriate place for it, Stephanie said vaguely. Maybe donate it to a museum, or find someone who collects antiques and could restore it properly. The important thing is making sure it goes somewhere it can be appreciated. The suggestion that a museum would provide better appreciation than the granddaughter who had actually spent time learning about antiques from the clock's previous owner was insulting on multiple levels. Stephanie was essentially arguing that I was too ignorant and too poor to properly value my own inheritance. I think I'll keep it, I said firmly. Grandma Rose wanted me to have it, and I want to understand why she made that choice. The family's frustration with my stubbornness was becoming increasingly obvious. They had expected me to be grateful for their generous offer to trade valuable items for my worthless inheritance, and my refusal to cooperate was clearly not part of their original plan. Emma, Aunt Monica tried one more time, her voice taking on the kind of warning tone that mothers use with unreasonable children. You need to think about this practically. Your grandmother was a wonderful woman, but she made some questionable decisions in her final months. You shouldn't feel obligated to honor choices that don't make sense, just because she wrote them in her will. The suggestion that I should ignore Grandma Rose's final wishes because they didn't align with the family's preferences was the final straw. These people had barely visited her during her illness, had shown no interest in her stories or her collection, and had spent the entire will reading calculating the monetary value of their inheritances. Now they wanted me to believe that their judgment about what made sense was superior to hers. I'm keeping the clock, I repeated, this time with enough finality that even Tyler seemed to recognize the futility of further argument. Fine, he said, his voice sharp with irritation. But don't come crying to us when you realize you chose a piece of junk over valuable items that could have actually improved your financial situation. Some people are too proud to accept help, even when it's clearly in their best interest. The parting shot was designed to make me feel foolish for refusing their generous offer, but it only reinforced my determination to discover what Grandma Rose had seen in the clock that I was apparently too stupid to understand. If my inheritance was really as worthless as they claimed, they wouldn't have been so eager to take it away from me. The harassment began almost immediately. Within 24 hours of the will reading, my phone started ringing with calls from family members who had suddenly developed urgent concerns about my emotional well-being and my ability to make sound financial decisions. Each conversation followed the same basic script: expressions of sympathy for my disappointing inheritance, gentle suggestions that Grandma Rose had been confused in her final months, and increasingly aggressive proposals for correcting the obviously unfair distribution of her estate. Carmen, my own mother, called first, her voice tight with the kind of anxiety that always accompanied discussions about money and family politics. "Emma, Mija, I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, and I'm worried that you're making a mistake by being so rigid about this clock situation." The word rigid stung, because it suggested that I was being unreasonable rather than simply honoring Grandma Rose's wishes. My mother had always been intimidated by her wealthier relatives, and her concerns seemed to stem more from fear of family conflict than from any genuine belief that I was making poor choices. "What kind of mistake?" I asked, though I suspected that Tyler or Monica had already gotten to her with their version of events. "Well, your cousins have been very generous in offering to trade some of their valuable pieces for your clock. It seems ungrateful to refuse their kindness, especially when they're trying to make sure everyone gets treated fairly." The idea that Tyler and Stephanie were being generous by offering to trade their leftovers for something they considered worthless would have been amusing if it hadn't been so transparently manipulative. They had clearly convinced my mother that I was being stubborn and ungrateful rather than simply exercising my right to keep my own inheritance. "Mom, the clock belongs to me. Grandma Rose specifically chose to leave it to me, and I want to understand why before I make any decisions about trading it away." "But Misha, what if there's nothing to understand? What if she really was confused and made a mistake? Your cousins live in beautiful houses where they could display an antique clock properly, and they're offering you things that would be more practical for your apartment." The assumption that my living situation was inappropriate for antique furniture reflected the same class-based prejudices that had driven the family's reaction to my inheritance. In their minds, valuable objects belonged with wealthy people, and I should be grateful to let my social superiors provide more suitable homes for things that were too good for someone of my economic status. Tyler called later that evening, his voice carrying the kind of forced patience that suggested he was making one final attempt to reason with an unreasonable person. "Emma, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I want to make sure you understand that we're not trying to take advantage of you. We're genuinely concerned about your best interests." "What exactly are you concerned about?" I asked. "Well, for starters, you're going to need to insure that clock if you plan to keep it, and antique insurance can be expensive. You'll also need to have it professionally cleaned and maintained, which could cost hundreds of dollars. And where are you going to put it? Your apartment doesn't have a mantel, and you can't just stick an antique timepiece on a bookshelf without damaging it." Tyler's catalog of potential problems was clearly designed to make me feel overwhelmed by the practical challenges of owning an antique clock. His assumption that I couldn't afford insurance or maintenance revealed his broader belief that poor people shouldn't be trusted with valuable objects because they lacked the resources to care for them properly. "I'll figure it out," I said, though I had to admit that his concerns about insurance and maintenance were legitimate issues that I hadn't fully considered. "Emma, be realistic. You make what, $40,000 a year? Do you really want to spend your limited income on insurance and restoration for a clock that doesn't even work? Wouldn't it make more sense to trade it for jewelry or art pieces that you could actually enjoy and afford to maintain?" The casual way he referenced my salary as if my financial limitations automatically disqualified me from owning nice things was infuriating. Tyler seemed to believe that economic status should determine who deserved to inherit family heirlooms, regardless of the deceased person's actual wishes. "Besides," he continued, "I've been doing some research on antique clocks, and most of them aren't worth nearly as much as people think. Unless you have something really special, like a piece made by a famous clockmaker or containing precious metals, You're probably looking at a few $100s in value at most. Is it really worth all this family drama for something that might be worth less than the jewelry pieces Stephanie offered you? Tyler's research was clearly intended to reinforce his argument that my inheritance was worthless, but something about his tone suggested that he wasn't entirely confident in his own conclusions. If the clock was really as valueless as he claimed, why was he working so hard to convince me to give it up? The pressure campaign escalated over the following days. Stephanie called to share her discovery that several local antique dealers had told her that most old clocks were reproductions or had been so heavily restored that they retained little of their original value. Uncle Richard phoned to express his concern that I was letting emotions cloud my judgment and making decisions that I would regret later. Even distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years suddenly reached out to share their opinions about the importance of keeping families together during difficult times. The most manipulative call came from Aunt Monica, who adopted the tone of a caring older relative providing gentle guidance to a confused young woman. "Emma, sweetheart, I've been talking to Tyler and Stephanie, and we're all worried that you're taking this inheritance situation too personally. Your grandmother loved you very much, but she was elderly and perhaps not thinking as clearly as usual when she made some of her final decisions." "What makes you think she wasn't thinking clearly?" I asked, genuinely curious about what evidence they thought they had for their claims about Grandma Rose's mental state. "Well, dear, leaving a broken clock to someone who lives in a small apartment, while giving valuable furniture sets to people who have houses and can properly display them." Monica's unfinished sentence hung in the air like a challenge, her implication clear, without being explicitly stated. In her mind, the distribution of Grandma Rose's estate reflected either senility or spite, neither of which should be honored by a reasonable person. The condescending way she discussed my living situation and my supposed inability to properly display antique furniture revealed exactly how she viewed my place in the family hierarchy. "Grandma Rose visited my apartment several times," I told her firmly. "She never seemed to think there was anything wrong with how I lived or what I could afford to maintain." "Oh, sweetheart," Monica replied with the kind of false sympathy that made me want to hang up immediately. "Your grandmother was always very kind about your circumstances. She wouldn't have wanted to hurt your feelings by pointing out the obvious practical limitations of your living situation." The suggestion that Grandma Rose had been humoring me out of pity was particularly galling because it contradicted everything I knew about her character. She had never been one to spare people's feelings when practical matters were at stake, and she had always been direct about her opinions regarding family members' choices and capabilities. "Monica," I said, abandoning the respectful aunt that had preceded her name throughout my childhood, "I'm keeping the clock." "That's final." The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line suggested that my use of her first name had not gone unnoticed. In Monica's world, younger family members were expected to show deference to their elders, especially when those elders were wealthier and supposedly wiser about important matters. "Emma, I hope you'll reconsider that attitude," she said, her voice taking on the chilly tone she typically reserved for service workers who had disappointed her. "Family relationships are more important than stubborn pride, and you're damaging those relationships by refusing to be reasonable about this situation." The accusation that I was damaging family relationships by keeping my own inheritance was breathtaking in its audacity. Monica was essentially arguing that I owed it to the family to give away something that legally belonged to me in order to maintain harmony with people who had never shown much interest in my well-being. "If family relationships are so important," I replied, "then maybe everyone should respect Grandma Rose's final wishes instead of trying to override them for their own convenience." Monica's silence suggested that she hadn't expected me to push back against her manipulation quite so directly. After a long pause, she tried a different approach. "Emma, you're young and you don't fully understand how these kinds of family situations work. Sometimes the people we love make decisions that don't reflect their true intentions. And it falls to the rest of us to interpret what they really would have wanted if they had been thinking more clearly." The paternalistic assumption that I was too young and naive to understand family dynamics was particularly insulting coming from someone who had barely maintained a relationship with Grandma Rose until her final illness. Monica's claim to understand my grandmother's true intentions rang hollow when she had shown so little interest in Grandma Rose's actual thoughts and feelings during her lifetime. I think Grandma Rose's intentions were perfectly clear, I said. She left specific items to specific people for specific reasons, and those decisions should be respected. Well, Monica said with the kind of finality that suggested she was giving up on persuasion and moving toward more aggressive tactics, I suppose we'll just have to see how this all works out. But I want you to know that your stubbornness is causing a lot of unnecessary pain for people who are still grieving your grandmother's loss. The implication that I was somehow not grieving Grandma Rose's death, or that my grief was less legitimate than that of family members who had barely visited her during her illness, was the cruelest cut of all. Monica was essentially arguing that my emotional connection to my grandmother was invalid if it led me to conclusions that differed from those of the family's financial decision-makers. After Monica hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling simultaneously angry and confused. The intensity of the family's campaign to convince me to give up the clock suggested that there was something about the situation that I didn't fully understand. If the timepiece was really as worthless as they claimed, why were they investing so much time and energy in trying to take it away from me? The sealed envelope from Grandma Rose sat on my kitchen table, unopened since the will reading 3 days earlier. I had been reluctant to read its contents, partly because I was afraid of discovering that my grandmother had indeed made some kind of cruel joke at my expense, and partly because I sensed that once I knew what the letter contained, there would be no going back to the simple family relationships I had known before. Finally, my curiosity overcame my apprehension. I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside, immediately recognizing Grandma Rose's distinctive handwriting despite the slight shakiness that had developed during her final months. "My dearest Emma," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I have passed on to whatever comes next, and you have just inherited something that will change your life in ways you cannot yet imagine. The mantel clock that now belongs to you is not what it appears to be, and neither are the family members who are undoubtedly pressuring you to give it up." My hands started trembling as I read those opening lines. Grandma Rose's matter-of-fact tone suggested that she had anticipated exactly the kind of pressure campaign that was currently being waged against me, and that she had planned accordingly. The clock came into my possession 42 years ago, when I was just beginning to establish my import business. A Tosta Trinity dealer in San Francisco was closing his shop and liquidating his inventory at prices that seemed too good to be true. Most of his pieces were exactly what they appeared to be: mid-range antiques with modest value and questionable provenance. But the clock was different. I found myself leaning forward as I read, completely absorbed in my grandmother's account of how she had acquired the timepiece that now sat in a cardboard box in my bedroom closet. The dealer told me it had belonged to a railroad family that had fallen on hard times during the Depression. They had sold it to him for $50 in 1934, desperate for cash and unaware of what they actually owned. He had kept it in his shop for decades, pricing it as a decorative piece rather than researching its origins. I bought it for $300, thinking it would look nice in my study. Grandma Rose's description of the clock's history suggested that multiple people had failed to recognize its true value over the course of several decades. The railroad family, the San Francisco dealer, and initially even Grandma Rose herself had all underestimated what they were looking at. It wasn't until 5 years later that I learned the truth about what I had purchased. A client brought me a piece that he claimed was made by the Chelsea Clock Company, and I decided to research the company's history to verify his claims. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about the timepiece sitting in my study. The mention of the Chelsea Clock Company made my heart start beating faster. Even with my limited knowledge of antique timepieces, I knew that Chelsea Clock was one of the most prestigious American clock manufacturers, with pieces that could command astronomical prices at auction. "Emma, the clock I have left to you was made by the Chelsea Clock Company in 1891, during the height of their artistic period. But it is not just any Chelsea clock. It bears the personal signature of Melvin Whittier, the company's master craftsman, who created fewer than 30 signed pieces during his entire career." I had to read that paragraph 3 times before its implications fully sank in. Grandma Rose wasn't just telling me that I had inherited a valuable antique. She was revealing that I now owned what appeared to be an extremely rare example of American clockmaking artistry. Only 12 Whittier-signed Chelsea clocks are known to exist in museum and private collections worldwide. The last one to come to auction sold for $2.8 million in 2018. But authentication is crucial, Emma, because reproductions and altered pieces are common in this market. The clock will need to be examined by experts who specialize in Chelsea Clock Company pieces. The number $2.8 million seemed impossible to process. I had been living paycheck to paycheck for years, carefully budgeting every purchase and postponing major expenses like car repairs and dental work. The idea that I might own something worth more than most people earned in their entire lifetimes was almost too overwhelming to contemplate. I have been aware of the clock's potential value for over 30 years, but I chose never to have it formally appraised or authenticated. I wanted to leave that decision to whoever inherited it after my death. However, I have kept detailed documentation of my research, along with photographs and measurements that will help establish its provenance. Grandma Rose's decision to avoid formal authentication made perfect sense from a practical standpoint. Once a piece was officially recognized as an extremely valuable antique, it would require expensive insurance, enhanced security, and constant worry about theft or damage. By keeping the clock's true nature secret, she had been able to enjoy it as a beautiful object without the complications that came with owning museum-quality artifacts. Emma, I am leaving this clock to you because you are the only person in our family who values objects for their beauty and historical significance rather than their monetary worth. You have spent years learning about antiques and developing an appreciation for craftsmanship that the others lack. But, more importantly, you have shown integrity and independence that will serve you well in handling whatever surprises this inheritance may bring. The validation from Grandma Rose meant more to me than any potential financial windfall. She had recognized qualities in me that the rest of the family either ignored or actively criticized, and she had structured her final gift to reward those qualities rather than conventional measures of success. Your cousins and their parents will try to convince you that the clock is worthless and that you should trade it for items they consider more practical or appropriate for your lifestyle. They will claim that I was confused or that my judgment was impaired by illness. Do not believe them. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. The accuracy of Grandma Rose's prediction about the family's behavior was uncanny. She had anticipated not just their general reaction to my inheritance, but the specific arguments they would use to try to convince me to give it up. If you decide to have the clock authenticated and appraised, I recommend Harold Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, who operates Chen & Associates Fine Art Appraisals on 16th Street. He has worked with Chelsea clock pieces before, and he has the expertise necessary to provide the kind of documentation that would be required for insurance or resale purposes. The practical advice about authentication showed that Grandma Rose had thought through every aspect of the situation I would face after inheriting the clock. She had even identified a specific expert who could help me navigate the complex process of establishing the piece's provenance and value. Emma, whatever you decide to do with this clock, remember that its true value lies not in what someone might pay for it, but in what it represents about the importance of recognizing beauty and craftsmanship that others overlook. You have always had that gift, and I trust you to use it wisely. The letter concluded with expressions of love and confidence that brought tears to my eyes. Grandma Rose had not only left me something potentially valuable, she had given me validation and encouragement that I would treasure regardless of what any appraiser might conclude about the clock's monetary worth. But the immediate practical question remained: what should I do with this information? The family's pressure campaign had intensified since the will reading, and I suspected that my continued refusal to trade the clock would only make their efforts more aggressive. At the same time, I knew that revealing the clock's potential value would transform the entire dynamic of our relationships in ways that might be irreversible. I decided to keep Grandma Rose's letter secret for the time being, while I figured out my next steps. The clock itself was safely stored in my bedroom closet, wrapped in the moving blankets that Tyler and Stephanie had grudgingly provided when they helped me transport it from Grandma Rose's house to my apartment. Looking at the timepiece now, with new knowledge about its potential significance, I could see details that I had previously overlooked. The wood appeared to be walnut, but not the ordinary walnut used in most furniture. This had a depth and richness that suggested old-growth timber of exceptional quality. The brass fittings showed the kind of patina that developed only over decades of careful handling, and the carved decorative elements displayed a level of craftsmanship that was clearly superior to mass-produced pieces. Most intriguingly, when I examined the clock face more carefully, I could make out what appeared to be a signature in the lower right corner, barely visible unless I held the piece at exactly the right angle to catch the light. The letters looked like MW, followed by what might have been a date, though the numbers were too faded for me to read with certainty. If Grandma Rose's research was accurate, those initials belonged to Melvin Whittier, and their presence on the clock face would be crucial evidence for any authentication process. The thought that I might be looking at the work of a master craftsman whose pieces were treasured in museums around the world was both thrilling and terrifying. The family's campaign to separate me from the clock entered a new phase when Tyler showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Saturday morning, accompanied by his wife Lisa and their 8-year-old daughter Madison. The presence of the child was clearly strategic. Tyler knew that I would be less likely to argue with him aggressively if Madison was listening to our conversation. "Hey Emma," Tyler said with forced casualness as I opened the door. "We were in the neighborhood and thought we'd stop by to see how you're doing." Lisa brought some of those chocolate chip cookies that Madison made yesterday. The transparent attempt to make their visit seem spontaneous and family-oriented would have been amusing if it hadn't been so obviously manipulative. Tyler lived in Cherry Hills Village, at least 30 minutes away from my Capitol Hill apartment, and there was no conceivable reason for them to be in the neighborhood on a Saturday morning. "Hi, Uncle Tyler," Madison said brightly, apparently unaware of the tension between the adults. "Daddy says you got a really old clock from Great-Grandma Rose. Can I see it?" The request from an innocent child put me in an impossible position. I couldn't refuse without seeming unreasonable, but I also suspected that Tyler had coached Madison to ask about the clock as part of his broader strategy to gain access to it. "Sure, sweetie," I said, leading them into my living room while mentally preparing for whatever Tyler had planned. Lisa immediately began examining my apartment with the kind of critical eye that wealthy people used when visiting the homes of their less fortunate relatives. Her gaze lingered on my secondhand furniture and the small size of my rooms, and I could practically see her calculating how much more space Tyler's family had for displaying valuable antiques. "This is such a cozy little place," she said with the kind of false enthusiasm that barely masked her pity. "You've done so much with the limited space you have." The backhanded compliment was clearly designed to reinforce Tyler's argument that I lacked adequate space for properly displaying antique furniture. Lisa's tone suggested that she viewed my apartment as charming in the way that miniature dollhouses were charming, cute, but ultimately inadequate for serious purposes. I retrieved the clock from my bedroom closet, carefully unwrapping it from the moving blankets and placing it on my coffee table where Madison could examine it safely. The little girl's eyes widened with genuine curiosity as she studied the intricate carved details and the ornate clock face. "It's really pretty," she said, running her finger along one of the decorative wooden scrolls. "Why doesn't it work?" "It just needs to be wound and cleaned," I explained, pleased that at least one member of Tyler's family could appreciate the clock's beauty without immediately calculating its monetary value. Old clocks like this one require special care to keep them running properly. Tyler moved closer to examine the timepiece, and I noticed that he was taking photos with his phone while pretending to listen to my explanation about clock maintenance. His behavior suggested that he was documenting the clock's condition and features, possibly for research purposes or future reference. "You know, Emma," Tyler said after Madison had lost interest and wandered over to look at my bookshelf, "I've been thinking more about this whole inheritance situation, and I realize I may have come across as pushy before. That wasn't my intention at all." The apparent apology was clearly the opening move in a new approach to convincing me to give up the clock. Tyler had apparently decided that aggressive pressure wasn't working, and had switched to a strategy based on false reasonableness and manufactured concern for my well-being. "I just want you to understand that we're all worried about you," he continued, settling into my armchair with the kind of casual possessiveness that suggested he viewed my space as an extension of his family's territory. "You're living alone, working at a job that doesn't pay very well, and now you're stuck with this antique that's going to require expensive maintenance and insurance. It doesn't seem fair that Grandma Rose put you in this position." Tyler's framing of my inheritance as a burden that Grandma Rose had unfairly imposed on me was particularly manipulative, because it positioned him as my protector while casting doubt on my grandmother's motivations. He was essentially arguing that accepting help from him would be more loyal to Grandma Rose's memory than honoring her explicit wishes. "I don't feel stuck," I replied carefully. "I'm grateful that Grandma Rose thought enough of me to leave me something that belonged to her." "But that's exactly my point," Tyler said, leaning forward with the earnest expression he used when making important business presentations. "Grandma Rose cared about you, which is why she wouldn't have wanted you to struggle with something that's beyond your means to handle properly. She would have wanted you to make practical decisions that improve your life rather than create additional stress and expense." The argument was cleverly constructed because it acknowledged my emotional connection to Grandma Rose while simultaneously undermining the legitimacy of my inheritance. Tyler was suggesting that the most loving thing I could do was ignore my grandmother's final wishes in favor of arrangements that he considered more practical. Lisa joined the conversation from across the room, where she had been examining my framed photographs with the kind of polite interest that wealthy people showed when viewing poor people's attempts at decoration. "Emma, Tyler and I have been talking about this situation, and we want you to know that we don't expect you to make any decisions that you're not comfortable with." The reassurance that they wouldn't pressure me was clearly designed to lower my defenses before they presented whatever new proposal they had developed. Lisa's tone suggested that she viewed herself as the reasonable mediator who could help resolve a difficult situation through compromise and mutual understanding. "But," she continued, "we do think there might be a solution that would work better for everyone involved. Tyler's been researching antique clocks, and it turns out that most of them require very specialized restoration work that can cost thousands of dollars. Even if you could afford that kind of expense, finding qualified craftsmen who work on pieces from that era can be almost impossible." Lisa's catalog of potential problems was clearly designed to make me feel overwhelmed by the practical challenges of owning an antique timepiece. Her emphasis on cost and complexity suggested that she viewed me as someone who lacked both the financial resources and the sophisticated knowledge necessary to care for valuable objects properly. "However," Tyler said, picking up where his wife had left off, "Stephanie and I have been talking to some dealers, and we think we found a solution that could benefit everyone. There's a collector in Aspen who specializes in antique timepieces, and he's expressed interest in purchasing old clocks for restoration and display in his private museum." Quote, "The mention of a private collector immediately raised red flags in my mind. If Tyler and Stephanie had already been discussing potential buyers for my clock, it suggested that they had moved far beyond simply wanting to trade family heirlooms and were now actively planning to convert my inheritance into cash. This collector," Lisa continued, "has offered to pay fair market value for antique clocks in any condition, even if they're not working. He specifically mentioned that he's looking for pieces from the late 19th century, which is exactly when your clock appears to have been made." The vague reference to, quote, "fair market value," without any specific dollar amounts, suggested that Tyler and Lisa either didn't know what the clock might actually be worth, or they were deliberately being evasive about the financial details of their proposed arrangement. "What kind of fair market value are we talking about?" I asked, curious to see how they would respond to a direct question about money. Tyler and Lisa exchanged glances before Tyler answered. "Well, that would depend on the specific maker and the condition of the internal mechanisms. But based on what we've seen of similar pieces, probably somewhere in the range of $800 to $1,500. The estimate was so far below what Grandma Rose's letter had suggested that I almost laughed out loud. Either Tyler was genuinely ignorant about the potential value of high-end antique clocks, or he was deliberately lowballing the estimate to make his proposal seem more reasonable. "Of course," Lisa added quickly, "that would be much more money than you'd get if you tried to sell it locally, and it would save you all the hassle and expense of trying to restore and maintain it yourself." The suggestion that I would be lucky to receive even that modest amount for the clock revealed exactly how little Tyler and Lisa understood about the antique market. Their assumption that local buyers would offer even less money suggested that they viewed my inheritance as a white elephant that I should be grateful to unload at any price. "And the best part," Tyler continued with growing enthusiasm, "is that we could arrange the whole transaction for you. Stephanie knows the collector personally, and she's already mentioned your clock to him. All you'd need to do is sign the paperwork, and we'd handle all the details of authentication, transport, and payment. The offer to handle all the details of the sale was particularly suspicious because it would give Tyler and Stephanie complete control over the process while leaving me dependent on their honesty about the final price and terms. I would have no way of knowing whether the collector had actually paid the amount they claimed, or whether additional money had been involved that they chose not to mention. That's very generous, I said carefully, but I think I'd prefer to do my own research before making any decisions about selling. Tyler's expression shifted slightly, revealing a flash of irritation that he quickly covered with renewed false concern. Emma, I understand wanting to be independent, but you have to be realistic about your limitations. You don't have connections in the antique world, and dealers take advantage of inexperienced sellers all the time. We're offering to protect you from getting cheated by people who would pay you a fraction of what the clock is actually worth. The irony of Tyler warning me about getting cheated while simultaneously trying to convince me to let him control the sale of my inheritance was breathtaking. His assumption that I was too naive and inexperienced to handle my own affairs revealed exactly how he viewed my capabilities and my right to make independent decisions. Besides, Lisa added, even if you did find someone locally who was interested in the clock, you'd have to pay for a professional appraisal, insurance during transport, and probably legal fees for the sale contract. By the time you factored in all those costs, you might not come out ahead financially. The suggestion that I couldn't afford the costs associated with properly selling an antique was designed to reinforce their argument that I should accept their help rather than trying to handle the situation independently. Lisa was essentially arguing that poor people shouldn't be trusted to manage valuable transactions because they lacked the resources to do so properly. Madison, who had been quietly playing with a puzzle book during most of this conversation, suddenly looked up and asked, "Daddy, why do you want Emma's clock so much? Don't we have enough clocks at our house?" The innocent question from Tyler's daughter cut straight to the heart of the matter in a way that all of our adult maneuvering had avoided. Out of the mouths of babes, as Grandma Rose might have said. Tyler's face flushed slightly as he struggled to explain his intense interest in my inheritance without revealing his true motivations. "Sweetheart, we're not trying to take Emma's clock away from her. We're just trying to help her make the best decision about something that might be difficult for her to handle by herself." Madison considered this explanation with the kind of skeptical expression that children used when adults weren't being entirely truthful. But if it's Emma's clock, shouldn't she get to decide what to do with it? The simple logic of a child's perspective on ownership and decision-making exposed the fundamental weakness in Tyler's argument. No matter how he framed his concerns about my capabilities or his offers to help, the basic fact remained that the clock belonged to me, and I had every right to make my own choices about its future. "Of course Emma gets to decide," Lisa said quickly, shooting Tyler a warning look. "We're just making sure she has all the information she needs to make a good decision." But Madison's question had already shifted the dynamic of our conversation. Tyler and Lisa's elaborate justifications for taking control of my inheritance suddenly sounded less like helpful advice and more like the manipulative pressure tactics they actually were. "I appreciate the offer," I said, standing up to signal that the visit was over. "But I'm going to take some time to think about my options before making any decisions." Tyler's frustration with my continued resistance was becoming increasingly obvious, despite his efforts to maintain a reasonable facade. "Emma, you can't just sit on this indefinitely. Antiques don't get more valuable while they're sitting in storage, and the longer you wait, the more likely it is that something will happen to damage the clock." The implicit threat that delay would somehow harm my inheritance was clearly designed to pressure me into making a quick decision that would benefit Tyler and his family. His sudden urgency about the clock's well-being seemed suspiciously convenient, given that he had been dismissing it as worthless just days earlier. "I'll be careful with it," I promised, beginning to wrap the clock back in its protective blankets. "But Emma," Lisa tried one more time, "you really should consider the practical aspects of this situation. Your apartment isn't exactly set up for storing valuable antiques, and if something happened to the clock while it was in your possession, you could be liable for its value." The suggestion that I might be financially responsible if the clock was damaged while in my care was particularly manipulative, because it implied that I faced potential legal or financial consequences for keeping my own inheritance. Lisa was essentially arguing that owning the clock was too risky for someone of my economic status. As Tyler's family prepared to leave, Madison gave me a hug and whispered, "I think your clock is really pretty, Emma. You should keep it if you want to." The child's simple expression of support meant more to me than all of Tyler and Lisa's elaborate arguments about practical considerations and fair market values. Madison had looked at the clock and seen something beautiful that deserved to be preserved, while her parents had seen only an opportunity to be exploited. After they left, I sat in my living room feeling more determined than ever to uncover the truth about my inheritance. Tyler and Lisa's visit had convinced me that there was definitely something about the clock that I didn't fully understand, and their eagerness to control its sale suggested that they suspected it might be worth more than they were admitting. The time had come to follow Grandma Rose's advice and seek professional authentication of the timepiece that was causing so much family drama. Harold Chen's appraisal shop occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in Denver's Art District, its large windows displaying an eclectic mixture of Asian antiques, contemporary sculptures, and vintage furniture that suggested both expertise and excellent taste. The sign above the door read, quote, "Chen & Associates Fine Art Appraisals," in elegant gold lettering, and the overall impression was of a business that catered to serious collectors rather than casual tourists. I had called ahead to schedule an appointment, explaining that I needed authentication services for a clock that might have historical significance. Harold's assistant had been professional but non-committal, warning me that the initial consultation fee would be $200, regardless of whether the piece proved to be valuable, and that comprehensive authentication could cost significantly more if the preliminary examination justified further research. The expense was substantial for someone living on my modest salary, but Grandma Rose's letter had convinced me that professional evaluation was essential. I couldn't make informed decisions about the clock's future without understanding what I actually owned, and the family's increasing pressure suggested that delay was becoming dangerous. Harold Chen himself was probably in his early 60s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of quiet confidence that came from decades of handling museum-quality artifacts. His workshop occupied the entire back half of the building, equipped with specialized lighting, magnification equipment, and reference libraries that immediately reassured me about his professional credentials. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, shaking my hand with a firm grip, "I understand you have a timepiece that may require authentication. What can you tell me about its provenance?" I had rehearsed this moment during the drive to his shop, trying to decide how much information to reveal about Grandma Rose's research and the family's reaction to my inheritance. Ultimately, I decided that honesty was the best approach. "It belonged to my grandmother who passed away recently," I explained, carefully placing the wrapped clock on his examination table. "She left it to me in her will, and she mentioned in a letter that it might be more valuable than it appears. My family thinks I'm being foolish for refusing to sell it, but I wanted to have it properly evaluated before making any decisions." Harold nodded as he began unwrapping the clock, his experienced hands moving with the kind of careful precision that suggested he had handled countless valuable artifacts. When the timepiece was fully revealed under his workshop's bright lights, I heard him draw in a sharp breath. "Interesting," he murmured, leaning closer to examine the clock face and the carved wooden case. "Very interesting indeed." He spent several minutes studying the piece from different angles, using a magnifying glass to examine details that I had never noticed. His expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see growing excitement in his eyes as he continued his preliminary inspection. "Ms. Rodriguez, before we proceed any further, I need to ask you some specific questions about this piece's history. Do you have any documentation about when and where your grandmother acquired it?" I explained what Grandma Rose had told me in her letter about purchasing the clock from a dealer in San Francisco in the early 1980s, and about her subsequent research into its potential origins. Harold listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details. "And you mentioned that your family has been pressuring you to sell the clock," he said when I finished recounting the recent events. "Have they given you any specific information about what they believe it might be worth?" I told him about Tyler's estimate of $800 to $1,500, and about the collector in Aspen who had supposedly expressed interest in purchasing antique timepieces. Harold's eyebrows rose slightly at these details, but he didn't offer any immediate commentary. "Ms. Rodriguez, I want to be very clear about what we're dealing with here before we continue, he said, setting down his magnifying glass and looking directly at me. Based on my preliminary examination, this clock warrants serious investigation. If my initial assessment is correct, we're potentially looking at a piece that could be worth substantially more than your family has suggested. The careful way he phrased his preliminary conclusions suggested that he was trying not to raise my hopes too high while acknowledging that the situation was more complex than I had initially understood. However, he continued, comprehensive authentication of high-value timepieces is an expensive and time-consuming process. We would need to examine the internal mechanisms, research the provenance extensively, and possibly consult with other experts who specialize in this particular maker. The total cost could easily reach several $1,000s. The mention of several $1,000s in authentication costs was sobering, but Harold's evident excitement about the clock's potential significance convinced me that the investment might be worthwhile. If Grandma Rose's research was accurate, authentication costs would represent only a tiny fraction of the piece's actual value. What would you need to do first? I asked. The immediate priority is examining the movement, the internal clockwork mechanism, Harold explained. The case and dial are certainly consistent with high-end American clockmaking from the 1890s, but the movement will tell us definitively who made this piece and when. That examination will cost $500 and will give us enough information to determine whether further research is justified. I agreed to the expanded examination, signing paperwork that authorized Harold to carefully disassemble the clock's case to access the internal mechanisms. The legal documents included strict liability waivers and insurance provisions that reinforced my understanding that we were potentially dealing with something extremely valuable. Harold's examination of the clock's movement took nearly 2 hours, during which I sat in his front office trying to distract myself with art magazines while fighting off waves of anxiety about what he might discover. The sounds of careful work, soft metallic clicks, occasional murmured comments, the whir of specialized equipment, drifted from the workshop area. When Harold finally emerged, his expression was a mixture of professional excitement and obvious concern. He asked me to join him in the workshop, where the clock sat partially disassembled on his examination table, its internal mechanisms exposed under bright examination lights. "Ms. Rodriguez," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "I need to show you what I've discovered, and then we need to discuss some serious implications for your security and insurance coverage." He pointed to a small brass plate inside the clock's case, barely visible unless viewed from exactly the right angle. Under magnification, I could make out engraved lettering that read, Chelsea Clock Co., Boston, followed by what appeared to be a serial number and additional markings that were too small for me to decipher. "This is definitely a Chelsea Clock Company piece," Harold confirmed, "made sometime in the early 1890s based on the movement design and construction techniques. But look here." He adjusted the magnification to focus on a different section of the mechanism. There, etched into the brass with microscopic precision, were the initials MW, followed by what appeared to be the number 27. "Melvin Whittier's personal signature," Harold said quietly. "This is the 27th piece he signed during his career with Chelsea Clock. Ms. Rodriguez, assuming this piece is authentic, and all my preliminary tests suggest that it is, you own one of the rarest examples of American decorative arts in existence." The confirmation of Grandma Rose's research hit me like a physical blow. She had been absolutely correct about the clock's significance, and her decision to leave it to me suddenly made perfect sense. She had entrusted me with something that represented not just monetary value, but historical and artistic importance that transcended any individual family's financial interests. "What kind of value are we talking about?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer from her letter. Harold consulted his reference materials before responding. Authenticated Whittier-signed Chelsea clocks are extraordinarily rare. The last documented sale was in 2018, when a piece in slightly inferior condition brought $2, $8 million at auction. Given the exceptional preservation of this example and the completeness of its original components, conservative estimates would place its value between $3, $2 and $3, $8 million. The numbers were so large that they seemed abstract, like statistics from a news report about someone else's life. The drive back to my apartment felt surreal, with the newly authenticated clock secured in Harold's professional transport case on my passenger seat. $3.2 million. The number kept echoing in my mind as I navigated Denver's afternoon traffic, trying to process the reality that I was now the owner of something worth more than most people would earn in their entire lifetimes. Harold had spent another hour explaining the technical details of the authentication process, showing me photographic evidence of Melvin Whittier's distinctive engraving techniques and comparing my clock to documented examples in museum collections. The precision of his analysis left no doubt about the piece's authenticity, but it also introduced a host of new complications that I hadn't anticipated. "Ms. Rodriguez," Harold had said as we completed the paperwork, "you need to understand that owning a piece of this significance comes with serious responsibilities. You'll need specialized insurance immediately, probably a rider on your renter's policy that could cost several $1,000s annually. You'll also need enhanced security measures, climate-controlled storage, and regular conservation maintenance." The practical implications of sudden wealth were daunting enough, but Harold's most serious warning concerned the immediate threat to my safety. "Word travels fast in the antique world," he had cautioned. "Once knowledge of this piece's existence becomes public, you could become a target for theft. I strongly recommend that you not discuss this authentication with anyone until you've made arrangements for proper security." Now, sitting in my small apartment with the most valuable object I had ever touched, resting on my kitchen table, I found myself facing decisions that would reshape every aspect of my life. The family's pressure campaign to convince me to sell the clock would intensify exponentially once they learned its true value, and I needed to be prepared for their reaction. My phone had been buzzing with messages throughout the afternoon, but I had ignored them during the authentication process. Now I discovered 6 missed calls from Tyler, 4 from Stephanie, and 3 increasingly frantic voicemails from Aunt Monica demanding to know where I was and why I wasn't responding to their attempts to contact me. The most recent message, left just 20 minutes earlier, came from Tyler and carried a distinctly threatening tone. "Emma, I don't know what game you're playing, but we need to talk immediately. Some antique dealer downtown has been asking questions about our family, and people are starting to talk. Call me back now." The message confirmed Harold's warning about information spreading quickly through Denver's antique community. Tyler's angry tone suggested that he had already learned something about the clock's potential value, and his reference to games indicated that he viewed my pursuit of authentication as some kind of betrayal rather than responsible ownership. Before I could decide how to respond to the family's increasingly aggressive messages, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Tyler and Uncle Richard standing on my doorstep, both wearing the kind of grim expressions that suggested this was not going to be a friendly social visit. "Emma, open the door," Tyler called out. "We know you're in there, and we need to discuss what you've been doing behind the family's back." The accusation that I had been acting behind the family's back by having my own property appraised was breathtaking in its entitlement. Tyler apparently believed that I owed the family consultation and approval before making any decisions about the clock's future. I considered ignoring them entirely, but their persistence suggested that they would continue harassing me until I agreed to speak with them. Better to face the confrontation on my own terms than to let them dictate when and how it would occur. "What do you want, Tyler?" I asked through the closed door. "We want to know why you've been sneaking around town getting the clock appraised without telling anyone," Uncle Richard replied, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when disciplining subordinates at his investment firm. "Harold Chin called me this afternoon asking questions about our family's connection to Chelsea clock pieces. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was to admit that I had no knowledge of what you were doing?" The revelation that Harold had contacted Uncle Richard directly was puzzling and concerning. Harold had seemed scrupulously professional during our interactions, and I couldn't understand why he would breach client confidentiality by discussing my business with other family members. "Why would Harold Chen call you?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Because his firm handles authentication for several of my clients," Richard explained impatiently. "When his name appeared on our caller ID, I naturally assumed he was calling about one of my accounts." Imagine my surprise when he started asking whether our family owned any documented Chelsea clock pieces. The explanation clarified the misunderstanding, but also revealed that Uncle Richard had learned about the authentication through his own business connections rather than through any breach of professional ethics. Still, his assumption that he deserved to be informed about my private business decisions reflected the same entitled attitude that had characterized the family's entire approach to my inheritance. "I had my property appraised," I said simply. "That's my right as the owner." "Emma, open this door right now," Tyler demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "We're not having this conversation through a piece of wood." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and allowed them to enter my apartment. Both men immediately began scanning the room, obviously looking for the clock, and their predatory expressions reminded me uncomfortably of the way sharks circled wounded prey. "Where is it?" Richard asked without preamble. "Where is what?" "Don't play stupid with us, Emma," Tyler snapped. "Harold Chen doesn't contact my father about worthless antiques. If he called asking about Chelsea clock pieces, it means your little clock is worth serious money." "How much?" The direct demand for financial information revealed exactly how Tyler viewed this situation. In his mind, the clock's value belonged to the family collectively rather than to me individually, and I was obligated to share any discoveries about its worth. "That's none of your business," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite my growing anxiety about their increasingly aggressive behavior. Richard stepped closer, adopting the intimidating posture he used during hostile business negotiations. "Emma, you're in over your head here. If that clock is genuinely valuable, there are legal and financial implications that you don't understand. Tax consequences, insurance requirements, security concerns. These aren't things that someone with your limited experience should try to handle independently." The condescending assumption that I was too inexperienced and unsophisticated to manage valuable property was particularly galling coming from someone who had shown no interest in mentoring or supporting me until money became involved. "I can learn what I need to know," I said. "This isn't about learning," Tyler interjected harshly. "This is about family responsibility and making sure that valuable assets are handled by people who have the resources and expertise to manage them properly. You can't just hide something worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in your apartment and pretend that everything is normal." Tyler's estimate of hundreds of thousands of dollars suggested that he had some knowledge of the clock's potential value, but was still dramatically underestimating its true worth. His reference to family responsibility revealed his belief that my ownership of something valuable created obligations to share both the asset and the decision-making authority with wealthier family members. "Grandma Rose left the clock to me specifically," I reminded them. "She wanted me to have it, not the family collectively." "Grandma Rose had no idea what she was giving you," Richard replied dismissively. "She thought she was leaving you a sentimental keepsake, not a major financial asset. There's a difference between honoring her emotional intentions and making responsible decisions about serious money." The argument that Grandma Rose's emotional intentions were somehow separate from her legal instructions was particularly insulting because it implied that my grandmother had been too sentimental and naive to understand the implications of her own decisions. "How do you know what Grandma Rose intended?" I asked. Tyler and Richard exchanged glances before Tyler responded. "Because we spent a lot more time discussing practical matters with her than you did. While you were playing with photography and talking about art history, we were helping her understand the financial realities of estate planning." The dismissive reference to my education and career as plain revealed exactly how Tyler viewed my contributions to the family and my qualifications for handling important decisions. In his mind, my interest in art and culture disqualified me from serious consideration as a financial decision-maker. "Emma," Richard said, apparently deciding to try a different approach, "we're not trying to take anything away from you. We're trying to protect you from making mistakes that could have serious consequences. Valuable antiques attract the wrong kind of attention, and people in your situation become targets for theft, fraud, and manipulation." The reference to "people in your situation" was clearly meant to highlight my economic vulnerability, while positioning Richard as my protector. He was essentially arguing that poor people shouldn't own valuable things because they lacked the resources to protect themselves from the dangers that came with wealth. What kind of mistakes are you worried about? I asked. For starters, inadequate insurance coverage, Tyler replied, pulling out his phone to show me something on the screen. I've been researching fine art insurance policies since Harold Chen's call, and we're talking about premium costs of at least $15,000 annually for a piece worth several $100,000. Can you afford that kind of expense on your museum salary? Tyler's research into insurance costs suggested that he had been planning this confrontation carefully, gathering ammunition to support his argument that I couldn't afford to keep the clock. His assumption that I would be intimidated by the financial requirements of ownership revealed his belief that economic pressure would succeed where emotional manipulation had failed. And that's just the beginning, Richard added. Climate control, security systems, conservation maintenance, legal documentation, the ongoing costs of properly maintaining a valuable antique can easily exceed the owner's annual income. You'd be better off selling the piece and investing the proceeds in something more appropriate for your financial situation. The suggestion that I should sell the clock and invest in something more appropriate was clearly designed to make their proposal sound like prudent financial advice, rather than a transparent attempt to separate me from my inheritance. What kind of investment did you have in mind? I asked. Well, for instance, Tyler said, the collector in Aspen that we mentioned before has increased his offer substantially since learning more about the clock's potential provenance. He is now prepared to pay up to $50,000 for an authenticated Chelsea clock piece in good condition. The revised offer of $50,000 was still a fraction of the clock's actual value, but it represented a significant increase from Tyler's earlier estimates. The fact that his mysterious collector had suddenly become much more generous suggested either that Tyler had learned more about the clock's worth than he was admitting, or that the collector was a fictional creation designed to provide cover for his family's plans. $50,000 would completely change your financial situation, Richard added enthusiastically. You could pay off your student loans, put a down payment on a house, establish an emergency fund. All the things that young people should prioritize instead of trying to maintain expensive antiques that don't provide any practical benefit. The argument that I should prioritize practical financial goals over preserving historical artifacts reflected the same materialistic worldview that had characterized the family's entire approach to Grandma Rose's collection. They viewed valuable objects as commodities to be liquidated rather than cultural treasures to be preserved. I'm not interested in selling, I said firmly. Tyler's face flushed with anger at my continued refusal to cooperate with their plans. Emma, you're being incredibly selfish about this. That clock represents generational wealth that could benefit the entire family, not just you. Grandma Rose would have wanted her estate to help as many people as possible, not just indulge one person's stubborn attachment to material objects. The accusation that I was being selfish for keeping my own inheritance was stunning in its audacity. Tyler was essentially arguing that my legal ownership of the clock created moral obligations to share its value with family members who had received their own substantial bequests. Tyler got furniture worth $18,000, I pointed out. Stephanie got $15,000 in bedroom sets and jewelry. You're not asking them to sell their inheritances and share the proceeds with the family. That's completely different, Richard replied quickly. Furniture and jewelry are personal items that people can use and enjoy. A museum-quality antique is a financial asset that should be managed like an investment portfolio. The distinction between personal items and financial assets was clearly designed to justify different treatment for different types of inheritances. In Richard's logic, my inheritance deserved special scrutiny because its value exceeded some arbitrary threshold that transformed it from a gift into a family resource. Besides, Tyler added, $18,000 in furniture isn't going to change anyone's life. $50,000 in cash could be transformative for someone in your economic situation. The condescending assumption that I needed financial transformation while Tyler and Stephanie could afford to keep their inheritances as decorative objects revealed the class-based prejudices that had always shaped the family's treatment of my mother and me. I've made my decision, I said. I'm keeping the clock. Uncle Richard's expression hardened into the kind of cold anger that he typically reserved for business adversaries who had crossed him. Emma, I hope you understand that we can't just walk away from this situation. If you insist on keeping something that valuable, there are going to be consequences that affect the entire family. The implicit threat in Richard's words was unmistakable. He was warning me that my refusal to cooperate would result in some form of retaliation, though he was careful not to specify exactly what those consequences might entail. "What kind of consequences?" I asked. Tyler leaned forward aggressively. "For starters, we're going to contest Grandma Rose's will." If she had known that the clock was worth serious money, she never would have left it to someone who can't afford to maintain it properly. We'll argue that her bequest was based on incomplete information and should be revised to reflect the true value of what she was distributing. The threat to challenge the will legally was the escalation I had been dreading but expecting. Tyler's argument that Grandma Rose would have made different decisions if she had known the clock's value was factually incorrect based on her letter. But I couldn't reveal that evidence without exposing the fact that she had been fully aware of the timepiece's significance. "Grandma Rose knew exactly what she was doing," I said carefully. "Prove it," Richard challenged. "Show us documentation that demonstrates her knowledge of the clock's value when she drafted her will." The demand for proof put me in an impossible position. I could produce Grandma Rose's letter, which would definitively establish her awareness of the clock's worth, but doing so would also reveal that she had anticipated the family's exact behavior and had planned accordingly. That revelation would only intensify their anger and their determination to find some way to override her decisions. "I don't need to prove anything," I replied. "The will is legally binding regardless of what you think Grandma Rose knew or didn't know." "Maybe," Tyler said with a cold smile, "but will contests can drag on for years, and they're expensive for everyone involved. Are you prepared to spend tens of thousands of dollars on legal fees to defend your right to keep something that you could sell for life-changing money?" The threat of prolonged litigation was clearly designed to intimidate me into accepting a settlement that would give Tyler and his family control over the clock. They were betting that I would be too frightened of legal costs and too overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation to maintain my resistance. "We could also pursue criminal charges," Richard added casually. "Concealing valuable assets during probate proceedings can constitute fraud, especially if the concealment affects the calculation of estate taxes and beneficiary distributions." The suggestion that I had committed fraud by having the clock appraised was legally absurd, but it demonstrated how far Richard was willing to go in his efforts to intimidate me into submission. He was essentially threatening to use his business connections and legal resources to make my life miserable, unless I agreed to their demands. "You're threatening to destroy my life because I won't give you something that belongs to me," I said, finally understanding the true nature of the people I had grown up viewing as successful role models. "We're trying to save you from destroying your own life," Tyler replied with false sincerity. "You're not equipped to handle this kind of wealth responsibly, and your stubbornness is going to hurt everyone involved, including yourself." The paternalistic assumption that I needed protection from my own inheritance was perhaps the most insulting aspect of their entire argument. Tyler was essentially claiming that my poverty disqualified me from making decisions about valuable property, and that wealthier family members had both the right and the responsibility to override my choices. "Get out of my apartment," I said quietly. "Emma," Richard began. "Get out now, or I'm calling the police." Tyler and Richard exchanged glances before reluctantly moving toward the door. As they reached the threshold, Tyler turned back for one final attempt at intimidation. "This isn't over, Emma. We're going to file papers to contest the will on Monday morning, and we're going to make sure that everyone in Denver knows exactly what kind of person keeps millions of dollars while their own family struggles with financial difficulties." The threat to damage my reputation publicly was the final confirmation I needed about the moral bankruptcy of the people who had spent my entire life lecturing me about family loyalty and responsible behavior. After they left, I sat in my apartment feeling simultaneously terrified and liberated. The family's mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the greed and entitlement that had always lurked beneath their veneer of respectability. They were prepared to destroy my life rather than accept that Grandma Rose had chosen to trust me with something valuable. But I also realized that I now possessed something that could transform not just my own future, but my ability to honor Grandma Rose's memory in ways that she would have appreciated. The clock wasn't just a valuable antique. It was an opportunity to break free from the toxic family dynamics that had shaped my entire life. Over the next several hours, I made a series of phone calls that would establish my independence from Tyler and Richard's threats. I contacted Harold Chen to arrange for immediate professional insurance coverage and secure storage for the clock. I reached out to a family law attorney who specialized in estate disputes to discuss my legal options for defending against will contests. Most importantly, I called the Denver Art Museum to explore the possibility of establishing a permanent exhibition featuring the clock as the centerpiece of a collection dedicated to American decorative arts. The idea of lending the clock to a museum exhibition had emerged from my conversation with Harold about the responsibilities that came with owning museum-quality artifacts. Rather than treating the piece as a private investment to be hidden away, I could share its historical and artistic significance with the public, while maintaining legal ownership and benefiting from professional conservation services. Dr. Patricia Williams, the museum's curator of American art, was immediately interested in discussing a potential exhibition. "Ms. Rodriguez," she said during our phone conversation, "authenticated Whittier pieces are extraordinarily rare. The opportunity to display one in Denver would be a tremendous coup for our institution and a wonderful gift to the community." The museum's enthusiasm for featuring the clock confirmed what I had suspected about its cultural significance. This wasn't just a valuable commodity to be bought and sold. It was a piece of American artistic heritage that deserved to be preserved and celebrated. 6 months later, I stood in the Denver Art Museum's newest gallery, watching visitors from around the world examine the clock that had nearly torn my family apart. The exhibition, titled "Time and Craftsmanship: American Decorative Arts in the Gilded Age," had drawn record crowds and international attention to Denver's cultural institutions. The museum had provided security, climate control, conservation services, and insurance coverage that far exceeded what I could have afforded independently. In return, I had negotiated a licensing agreement that provided me with a modest annual income, while ensuring that the clock would be properly maintained and publicly accessible for the next 20 years. Tyler and Richard had followed through on their threat to contest Grandma Rose's will, but their legal challenge had collapsed when I produced her letter documenting her full awareness of the clock's value and her explicit instructions about her bequest. The revelation that she had anticipated their exact behavior and planned accordingly had been deeply embarrassing for them, and they had quietly dropped their lawsuit after 6 weeks of expensive legal proceedings. The family relationships that had once defined my social world were irreparably damaged, but I found that I didn't miss the constant pressure to conform to their materialistic values or accept their condescending treatment. Stephanie had made one attempt at reconciliation, calling to congratulate me on the museum exhibition and hint that she regretted the family's behavior during the will dispute. But her inability to acknowledge the fundamental selfishness of their actions made genuine forgiveness impossible. My mother, who had initially been terrified by the family conflict, eventually came to understand that my decision to honor Grandma Rose's wishes had been both legally and morally correct. The modest income from the museum licensing agreement had allowed me to help with her medical expenses and home repairs, creating the kind of mutual support that Tyler and his family had always claimed to value but had never actually provided. Standing in that museum gallery, surrounded by visitors who appreciated the clock's beauty and historical significance, I finally understood what Grandma Rose had been trying to teach me about the difference between price and value. The timepiece was worth millions of dollars, but its true worth lay in what it represented about the importance of recognizing quality and craftsmanship that others overlooked. The inheritance had changed my life, but not in the ways that Tyler and Richard had anticipated. Instead of making me wealthy in conventional terms, it had made me rich in ways that mattered more: independence from toxic relationships, confidence in my own judgment, and the satisfaction of preserving something beautiful for future generations to enjoy. Sometimes the most valuable gifts are the ones that teach us who we really are and what we truly value. Grandma Rose had given me much more than an antique clock. She had given me the tools to build a life based on authentic relationships and meaningful work, rather than material accumulation and social status. The clock continues to keep perfect time, just as Grandma Rose had always known it would. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.